This is The Red Line, where we interview three geopolitical experts on one big issue shaping the news both here and overseas. And I'm your host, Michael Hilliard. Now, I want to start this week with what seems like a pretty simple question. In fact, one that's likely to pop up in the very first few weeks of any poli-sci class. That question being, what is a country? Now, you see, at first it sounds pretty obvious. We all kind of know what a country is. Australia, Mauritania, the United States, we all agree they're countries. And if we were to open a poli-sci textbook, we start to see some of the requirements that a country needs. The country usually being defined by things like having clear borders, a defined population, a functioning government, and international recognition. And whilst all three of those countries would definitely meet that requirement, once we actually start to unpack this a bit, it does get a bit complicated. For one, let's look at clear borders, as a lot of countries in the world don't actually meet that requirement. For example, whilst most of us can probably agree that India and Pakistan are states, neither of those guys can agree on where their borders actually lie. So it would technically take them out of the running. Okay, so what if we put that aside and go to the next rule? That one being having a defined population. Well, that would make sense for a lot of countries, but if true, it would also mean the Kurds and the Rohingya have a state as well. So obviously we can't use that as our definition. Okay, what about a functioning government? Well, putting aside the fact that that might actually knock out quite a few governments at the moment, it also means that states like Somaliland and Transnistria would require recognition, as they both have functioning governments as well as the other two prerequisites. However, it's that fourth rule that had tripped these guys up, as currently no UN-recognized states formally recognize Transnistria or Somaliland. So without a doubt, the most difficult of those four prerequisites to acquire is got to be international recognition. However, it wouldn't knock out the territory we're talking about today, that being Abkhazia, a Russian-backed breakaway state currently regarded by the UN as a state of the Republic of Georgia. Now, Abkhazia isn't the only breakaway state from Georgia, the other being South Ossetia. But whilst South Ossetia, with a population of just over 20,000, operates pretty much just like a military outpost for the Russians, Abkhazia's situation is slightly different, as it not only has a pretty different history to the rest of Georgia, but it also has a much more vibrant and complicated political scene than South Ossetia does, where just over the last few years, multiple leaders have been removed from office, public protests have stormed Capitol buildings, and presidents have found themselves on the wrong end of poisonings. Add to this bitter debates about property rights, a back and forth over sovereign control with Russia, a tightening and more aggressive border with Georgia, while simultaneously dealing with a more interventionist Russia threatening to cut off electricity to the region. And all of this unfolding just a few hundred kilometers from the front lines of a completely different war. One that is absolutely having effects here in Georgia as well. So this week, we're going to be taking a look at the breakaway Republic of Abkhazia, trying to answer a few core questions. Like, how did Abkhazia arrive at this position? Can they really truly call themselves an independent state when they're so dependent on the Russians for their economy? And with the government in Tbilisi increasingly showing warm feelings toward Russia, and the people of Abkhazia once again turning away from Russia, where does that leave the balance of power in Georgia going forward? Well, those are just some of the questions we're going to be tackling here today. And to help us understand how we got here, what's currently driving the politics in Abkhazia, and what makes it so different from both Georgia, Russia, and South Ossetia, we turn to our first guest.
Part 1. The Breakup.
Abkhazia is a beautiful part of Georgia. It's on the sunny Black Sea coast with the beautiful North Caucasus Mountains nearby. So from a tourist perspective, it's really beautiful, like mandarin groves and teas.
Laura Lindemann is a senior fellow for Eurasia and the director of programs at the Central Asia Caucasus Institute, where she specializes in Georgian politics, economics, and foreign relations. And before that, Laura was a senior fellow with the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council, where she would teach US officials preparing to depart for Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. So we're thrilled to have her on the program today.
So I think that Abkhazia is quite interesting and important to understand in the post-Soviet space. It's not just another regional conflict within the Caucasus. I think it's a broader example of Russia's post-Soviet playbook.
Okay, so before we go any further, let's take 2 minutes and lay down some of the groundwork here, just so we all know exactly where we're all standing. Now, Abkhazia is a breakaway republic which is part of the UN-recognized nation of Georgia, wedged between Russia to the north, Georgia proper to the south and east, and the Black Sea to the west. Now, whilst the majority of nations would recognise it just as a part of Georgia, there are 5 countries that do recognise it as an independent state, those being Venezuela, Nicaragua, Nauru, Syria, and most importantly, Russia. Now, the capital of this unrecognised republic is a city called Sukhumi, a city that once did formally function as a bustling resort hub during the USSR, in a somewhat equivalent way to how Sochi does for the Russians today. Now, before we get into any more of the really complicated stuff, let's start with the demographic makeups, as this remains one of the most contentious issues when you talk about Abkhazia, with some of the figures suggesting it's majority ethnically Abkhaz, and others suggesting it's majority ethnically Georgian. So with that in mind, Laura, let's zoom in a little closer, and can you take us through why there is this debate around the demographics of the country?
So before the Soviet Union, when it was Imperial Russia, there was actually a majority in the region. And then Soviet nationalities policy made it an autonomous republic, not a full SSR like Georgia, and encouraged more Georgian settlement in Abkhazia so that Georgians became the majority ethnicity in Abkhazia during the Soviet period. I mean, the numbers are always contested. So ranging in 200 to 250,000 ethnic Georgians were expelled from Abkhazia. They went pretty much all over the country of Georgia, but about, you could say 40% settled in the capital. Also a large portion settled in the Samegrelo the region neighboring Abkhazia. And since that 1993 period, you see them moving throughout the country.
Okay, so before we get much further into today's story, let's rewind the clock back a bit and lay out a bit of the key historical groundwork here. And as is tradition here at the program, we'll be radically oversimplifying an incredibly complex history into just a few minutes. Now, Abkhazia had originally been absorbed into the Russian Empire during the 19th century. And then in 1931, it became an autonomous republic within the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, or an SSR, but with its own limited autonomy. Notably though, that autonomy did come with some pretty heavy caveats, and ultimately the decision-making would still be up to Tbilisi. Now, whilst this was the original arrangement, by the late 1930s, Abkhazia would find itself heading into Stalinist purges. I mean, after all, the guy was only born a few hours' drive from here, with somewhere around 80% of the country's leadership, institutions, and cultural figures being systematically purged from Abkhazia. Now, this obviously left a pretty long-standing scar on the relationship between the Abkhaz and the ethnic Georgian populations, and that scar would continue to fester throughout the Soviet era. Now, all of this would start to come to a head in the late 1980s when the USSR really began to unravel, where according to the Soviets' 1989 census, ethnic Georgians would make up about 45% of the population in Abkhazia, and the ethnic Abkhaz making up just about 18% of the population, which created a pretty delicate and deeply unstable demographic mix, particularly when contrasted against the rising Georgian nationalism that was starting to clash elsewhere in the country. Now, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Abkhazia declared sovereignty, not full independence, but definitely a clear move away from Tbilisi's authority. Now, the Georgian government itself, in a bit of political chaos at the time, responded to this by launching a military operation into Abkhazia in August 1992, seizing key towns like Gali and the coastal resort of New Athos, before eventually advancing as far as the Gumista River, just outside the capital Sukhumi. And whilst they had these rebellious Abkhaz on the run, that's where Moscow stepped in, demanding a ceasefire from both sides to hopefully stop the violence and, by coincidence I'm sure, also give the Abkhaz a chance to be reinforced and regroup. Now, it was during this ceasefire that Russia used the pause to quietly rearm the Abkhaz side, as well as facilitating the entry of a paramilitary coalition known as the Confederation of Mountain Peoples of the Caucasus. These guys effectively being drawn from various North Caucasian republics, before then being trained, transported and backed by the Russian security services, and then inserted into Abkhazia. Now, once inside the country, the Abkhaz and the CMPC forces would then shatter the ceasefire, quickly overrunning a lot of the Georgian positions, before Russian troops could then shortly arrive afterwards to solidify their positions around Gudata. And from there, the campaign would continue to escalate rapidly, with successive offensives launched by the Abkhaz and their allies right throughout late 1992 and into 1993. Now, eventually, these offensives would start to run out of steam, and by July 1993, another ceasefire would be signed between the Abkhaz and the Georgians. But much like last time, after reinforcement, and within weeks, that too was violated. This time, with an Abkhaz assault being supported by direct Russian air power, with the last Georgian positions in Sukhumi being bombed by Russian air power. And by September 1993, the capital of the region had fallen, and most of the remaining Georgian forces fell back into retreat, And by the end of the year, Georgia, now effectively exhausted and defeated, was then forced into an agreement with Russia whereby they would join the Russian-led Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS, as well as signing off on the establishment of Russian bases in Abkhazia and later South Ossetia, and that Russian troops would remain within Abkhazia to protect the Abkhaz population, effectively forcing Tbilisi to acknowledge that Russia would occupy 2 provinces of the newly independent Georgia. And the war had cost Georgia pretty dearly, as before the conflict, roughly half of Abkhazia's population had been ethnically Georgian, and by the time the final ceasefire line was finally drawn in 1994, an estimated 250,000 Georgians had been expelled from the region, in what many international observers would later refer to as ethnic cleansing. And the end result was that a region that Soviet planning had once tried to shape into a Georgian majority republic was now once again back firmly held in the hands of a militarized Russian-backed Abkhaz elite. So Laura, before we start looking further from 1994, can you give us a bit more insights into this period of time and how both sides exactly ended up on this path?
You see, the Abkhaz would like to portray the fighting as an Abkhaz victory against the Georgians, where the Georgians would like to say this was basically a Russia-Georgia war before the 2008 war. And it wasn't really either of those. Russian policy at the time was a bit messy and scrappy. You had the Yeltsin folks and the defense ministry folks who were acting a bit inconsistently as how they approached Abkhazia, but generally the Russian sympathies were with the Abkhaz side. For example, the Russian Air Force at the Gudauta base were actively arming, including with Abkhaz fighters and North Caucasian volunteers. The Russian military hardware, logistics, and air support were critical in Abkhaz victories. For example, capture of Gagra in 1992 and Sukhumi in 1993. So while maybe it wasn't completely clear the extent of which and in which arenas the Russians were supporting the Abkhaz, and even I think probably sometimes elements of Russian forces were supporting Georgians as well. Still, overall, I think you can see examples of very specific Russian backing that helped the Abkhaz win decisively. The war ended with a complete Georgian defeat. There was a ceasefire agreement that institutionalized Russia's military presence in Abkhazia, which was called the Commonwealth of Independent States Peacekeeping Force. So Russian troops on the ground in Abkhazia.
So by 1994, with the Georgian army in full retreat, Sukhumi in ruins, and the Russian-backed forces now pretty firmly in control of the majority of Abkhazia, why would the Russians stop there? I mean, if the Georgian military was on the ropes and the road to Tbilisi was wide open, why would they stop where they did?
The Russians were a mess in this period. They didn't really have a unified policy, and I don't think the Yeltsin government was really strategizing on what they should do at this point. Different aspects of the Russian government had different priorities as well.
Okay, since there's a lot to cover here, let's push forward to the 2000s. Now, starting in 2003, Georgia undergoes what's known as the Rose Revolution, a revolution led by a man whose legacy is probably responsible for more bar fights in Tbilisi than any other human being on the planet, Mikhail Saakashvili. Now, Saakashvili sweeps into power on a hardline, pro-Western platform, pledging to move Georgia towards NATO and the EU no matter the cost, a sentiment that a lot of Georgians did actually support, and something that may not have seemed as crazy at the time. As remember, this is back in 2003, during a period of time where relations between Russia and the US were particularly good. That was right up until about the Iraq War. However, it was also Saakashvili that became a bit of a thorn, but as Saakashvili made multiple calls to reintegrate the breakaway regions back into Georgia, something that Russia was strictly opposed to. Then, in 2004, this divide between the West and Russia deepens further, as that's the year when 7 more countries end up joining NATO, including Slovenia, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and most importantly, because it was the first time that Soviet republics had officially joined the alliance, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which from Moscow's perspective was a bit of a red line being crossed. Although I would point out that it was probably more up to Tallinn than it was Moscow on who and who doesn't join NATO. However, for Moscow, things would only get worse as time went on, as in 2005, the US President George W. Bush would end up visiting Georgia, a symbolic gesture that still resonates in Tbilisi today. In fact, the main road from the airport back into the city is still named after George Bush. And Saakashvili seemed to have a very good relationship with the US President, so feeling emboldened by the Western support, he would go on to publicly demand the return of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, the other breakaway region, back to Georgia. And when Russia inevitably rejected it, Tbilisi then ramped up its defense spending to nearly 10% of GDP. Then fast forward to 2006, and the situation only gets worse, with Georgia formally withdrawing from the CIS, and Saakashvili demanding that all troops leave Georgian territory. Now, Russia did somewhat comply to this, with Russia pulling all of its troops from Georgia proper back into Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and lowering the amount of overall troops it had in the region, leading to tensions only spiraling further. And by 2007, it really seemed that these two countries were on a bit of a collision course, at which point we hit 2008, where things really began to boil over. You see, 2008 is the year that the US formally recognizes Kosovo's independence, Kosovo being a breakaway republic of Russian ally Serbia, and it's a move that really enrages Moscow. And the US didn't really stop there either, as at that year's NATO summit in Bucharest, just a few months later, George Bush stood on stage and pushed for a membership action plan for both Georgia and Ukraine, stating that those two countries would be members of NATO. Now, to most analysts, everyone knew that wasn't going to happen. Georgia, for one, had territorial disputes, and more importantly, France and Germany said they didn't know anything about the plan and didn't support letting those two countries into NATO. Again, 2008 was a very different time. And while the analysts understood this, Saakashvili may not have. Saakashvili supposedly seeing this as even more endorsement of his country by NATO. Meanwhile, tensions between Russia and the West continue to escalate, and by March, a Georgian reconnaissance drone is shot down over Abkhazia, a move that had prompted Saakashvili to keep mounting the tensions. In response, in April, Russia would deploy another 2,500 troops into the separatist territories, meaning that over the following months, which saw bomb plots, arrests, and border clashes, the two states would place themselves on a collision course for war. Now, it was then over these build-up months that Russia not only repaired the train lines heading into Abkhazia, allowing for a far quicker reinforcement and redeployment of forces, but it also began to run large military drills within the Caucasus, inviting the Abkhazian and South Ossetian militaries to join them, a move that quietly explained the growing presence of Russian troops in the region. Now, in response, NATO would also run massive exercises in the area, inviting the Georgians to participate in those ones, which now brings us pretty much up to the 2008 war. Now, if you're interested in a really deep dive into that one, we have a full video elsewhere with the maps, invasion strategies, and everything else, which you can go check out on YouTube. But in short, the two sides ended up going to war, as in August, after months of skirmishes and rising tension, Georgia launched an assault into South Ossetia, storming into the regional capital, Tbilisi. Now, depending on who you ask, Saakashvili was either goaded into it by the Russians, who continued to keep escalating the border tensions until he felt he had to do something, or if you ask others, Saakashvili had been told by the US that the US would have his back if he carried out such a move, which, as we all know, is support that never came. And instead, within the first couple of days of the Georgians crossing the border, they found themselves being pushed out of South Ossetia and now having to fight the Russian army pouring into their country from both Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And within days, the main highway linking East and West Georgia was cut, and Russian forces began advancing toward Tbilisi, at which point Condoleezza Rice, the US Secretary of State, would arrive into the country and demand Saakashvili accept Moscow's terms for a ceasefire. Now, after the fighting, when the dust finally settled, South Ossetia and Abkhazia both ended up expanding their territory, with the Abkhaz forces in particular taking control of the Upper Kudori Valley, something that had remained within Georgia's control since independence. In addition to this expansion of territory, Russia's victory here also saw the Russian parliament finally make the move to formally recognize both of the breakaway republics as independent states, meaning it would be much more difficult to try and reverse that position in future negotiations. So, Laura, I understand wanting to hold on to these breakaway territories, but 2008 really became the point of no return in the split between Russia and the West. So what do you think actually prompted Russia to go in and defend these two breakaways with such force?
I think this was a calculated strategy and a component of what they were considering ahead of 2008. They were calculating, let's try to repair the railway from Ochamchire and prepare military infrastructure in Abkhazia as a just in case. I don't think that they particularly loved Mikhail Saakashvili, the then president of Georgia, who had quite a belligerent and independent approach towards Russia. I think that they saw it as a way in which they could have another point of leverage against Georgia at the time. They went ahead and repaired the railway in Abkhazia before the invasion in 2008, which I'm not sure they would necessarily have done for no strategic reason. And also there was evidence of preparing military infrastructure ahead of the 2008 war. One can make a very strong argument that the 2008 war between Georgia and Russia was an early example of what we see Russia do in 2014 in Crimea. It was a test case and a good example of Russian hybrid warfare tactics. If you look at Putin now, maybe an early way in which he wanted to reinstitute the imperialist view of Greater Russia and reinforce his neighborhood with countries he felt were moving westward. So it was probably part of a longer-term deliberate strategy on the part of the Kremlin to make neighboring states fall in line, and Georgia was the early test case for that strategy.
Now, as a side effect of all of this, and somewhat unsurprisingly, relations between Abkhazia and the rest of Georgia went from strained to outright hostile. And whatever hope there was of reconciliation between these two pretty much evaporated after 2008. And whilst Abkhazia probably was pretty appreciative of Moscow coming to their aid, that help didn't come without strings either. Because while Russia's military support did help secure Abkhaz control on the ground, it also locked the region in near total economic dependence on the Kremlin. And that dependency has actually only deepened since. You see, today, Abkhazia's economy is overwhelmingly propped up by Russian subsidies, with Moscow paying everything from the pensions to finances and infrastructure. So Laura, the question I'm going to ask you here is, how reliant is Abkhazia on Moscow today? Where does that number sit now?
Well, so the situation in Abkhazia is quite different than in Georgia. Abkhaz economy is heavily dependent on Russia. So there's differing numbers, but somewhere between 40 and 80% of their annual budget comes from Russian subsidies. They use this aid as leverage to ensure political compliance. Most of their economic sectors are influenced by Russian capital, like tourism. They're almost 100% dependent on Russian tourists. Their agriculture exports, which are citrus, hazelnuts, tea, tobacco, and wine, go overwhelmingly to Russian markets. Electricity shortages are covered by highly subsidized Russian imports. Their infrastructure, the Russian railways, fully manages their rail system. And then new business ventures are almost fully and exclusively Russian funded. So their economy is designed around the Russian market access, and Russia can easily manipulate any of their current sectors. So I think they'd have a tough time diversifying away from that heavy dependence.
We'll go into it in more detail with our next guest, but as a bit of a summary here, does this also extend to the military as well?
So my understanding is that the Abkhaz military is very much beholden to Russia. There was a 2014 treaty as well called the Combined Group of Forces, which means that in practicality that Russia's calling the shots militarily. And if there's military action, the Russian Ministry of Defense would be appointing commanders and calling the shots. In general, there's been a Russian attempt to gradually unify command systems, logistics, how much Abkhaz soldiers get paid.
Okay, so if Russia's paying the bills, training the forces, and even commanding some of these troops, then why doesn't Russia just annex the territory outright? Do you think they ever would?
I think it doesn't annex Abkhazia because the Abkhaz are fully against becoming part of Russia. They are interested in independence, not in being part of Russia. And that's another way in which they're different from the South Ossetians, who feel connected to the North Ossetians. And the South Ossetians don't feel like they need to have independence, where annexation to them could be a suitable option. The Abkhaz absolutely do not find being part of Russia as one of the possibilities for their future.
Well, since you mentioned South Ossetia, that brings us to an interesting point, because having spent enough time in Georgia over the years, one thing I've always noticed is that when you speak to the average Georgian about these two republics, you'll usually get a pretty clear answer when it comes to South Ossetia, where about 80-90% of the people you speak to will tell you outright that South Ossetia is just a puppet state, it's an artificial state, and it's entirely made up by Moscow. End of story. But when you ask those same people about Abkhazia, the answers get a little more complicated. Now, you still get plenty of Georgians, maybe half, maybe even a little bit more, who will say the same thing about Abkhazia, but it's rarely the same sort of automatic certainty that you do get with South Ossetia. So why is that? Why is there such a noticeable difference in how the Georgians view Abkhazia to how they view South Ossetia?
I think number one is just the amount of people there and history. So South Ossetia is a maximum 20,000 people. So it's tiny. It's connected to the north through one small tunnel through the North Caucasus Mountains. And so it's not particularly economically interesting. The South Ossetians and the North Ossetians do have long ties, but they're a very small group. Whereas Abkhazia, historically, a very unique area that was heavily populated by a variety of peoples, including Greeks and Armenians, and before that, Circassians earlier on. So it's quite large. Geographically, the population is much larger. It's a very beautiful tourist destination, and it has a particular history that's been well documented over the years. So I think everyone recognizes it as having its own unique history, which includes a dynamic interaction with Imperial Russia. There was a large out-migration to Turkey that was forced by Tsarist Russia, for example. And West Georgians have had a long history as well with the Abkhaz. But Georgia is quite regional, and so there's a very unique particular history of Abkhazia and its connection to West Georgia and also the other North Caucasus people. And then the way in which that relationship connects to Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union.
Okay then, but how does the Georgian government view this situation? For the sake of the argument, if you were able to sit down with the leadership in Georgia in a private room and ask them what should be done about Abkhazia or how they feel toward it, what do you think the answer would be?
Such a good question. If you could ask 10 Georgia watchers, you would get 10 different answers. The current Georgian Dream government, which is led by the billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, is very worried about Russia and that Georgia would be next after the 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. There has been a long-term trend to accommodate Russia since, we can argue about what year that started, but they have more decisively moved towards more than accommodation with Russia since the 2022 war. I believe that's probably a personal calculus on the part of Ivanishvili, where he would like to remain safe and secure in his position of power, and that means accommodating Russia. I think there's definitely some infiltration of the Georgian security services by Russia. This has been a slow process to accommodate Russia, not a complete takeover. So we're starting to see a movement towards Russia in that direction. This is a reversal of a long-term trend where there had been a strong independence of Georgian institutions from Russia.
Now, Bidzina Ivanishvili is probably someone we could justify doing an entire episode on, as he's incredibly important to the entire Caucasus politics. As for one, not only is he the former Prime Minister of Georgia, but he's also the richest man in Georgia as well, and not by a little bit either, by a mile, as just his personal net worth makes up somewhere around 20 to 22% of the entire country's GDP, and his influence over Georgian politics is absolutely vast, to the point where almost every single senior figure in Georgian politics, including members of the cabinet, has either worked for Ivanishvili directly or has worked for one of his companies. For Georgia, he's not just an oligarch, he's the oligarch, a man who concentrates so much power in a single set of hands, to a point that America probably won't reach for at least 30 years. Now, Ivanishvili made a huge part of his fortune during the transition toward capitalism, and has structured large parts of the entire Georgian economy around himself, with Ivanishvili building a lot of the economy to work as a conduit between Western and Russian companies. And that matters because Ivanishvili still has a considerable personal fortune tied up with Russia. So much so, in fact, that there's actually been serious talk over the years about trying to normalize some relations between the two, likely starting with the reopening of the rail lines that run through Abkhazia into the west of Georgia, lines that have been shut down since about 2008. So the question is, how realistic do you think that future is? Is there a world where Ivanishvili or the current Georgian Dream government could actually get something like that passed?
I actually think that things now have changed in that direction. There is a possibility there. That's one thing that has changed. Russia would absolutely be interested in connecting Abkhazia to Georgian infrastructure, especially the railway. For Russia, creating a direct rail link to Armenia, even though Armenia has pivoted, is still probably in their long-term strategic calculus. But even a larger picture would be a north-south transit corridor, Russia to Iran and the Middle East. An alternative when you're dealing with Russian sanctions is in their benefit. Also, infrastructure would probably mean that it's on Russian terms. So some sort of territorial integration on Russian terms is in their benefit as well. I think the Georgian Dream at this point potentially could agree to it. We saw early on that Ivanishvili was interested in this railway. They tend to be leaning towards their northern neighbors, Russia friendly. So the timing could be quite interesting to see what happens as far as infrastructure connections between Abkhazia and Georgia in the short term. So definitely a space to look at.
When it comes to Caucasus politics, the only real constant is probably change. As just over the last few years, we've seen Armenia start to pivot away from Russia, at least partially, as well as seeing Georgia and its ruling party, Georgian Dream, start to pivot back toward Russia. And so that raises a question. What about Abkhazia? As whilst, yes, the territory is incredibly dependent on Russia, we have also seen massive anti-Russian protests break out throughout the region, as well as the ousting of a sitting Abkhaz president. So what's actually going on in the territory if we start to look under the hood? Is this genuine pushback on Moscow's influence, or just a reshuffling of deck chairs under the same umbrella? And most importantly, what is Russia willing to do to hold on to its influence here in Abkhazia? Well, to help us unpack all that, we turn to our second guest.
Part 2. A new track.
Well, understanding Abkhazia, it should be a key to understanding the entire South Caucasus region. And understanding Abkhazia can also answer questions related to Ukraine, I believe, and predict what can happen in the next 5 or 10 years.
Beka Bajalitze is the Caucasus Regional Director at the Institute of War and Peace, specializing in the politics and military affairs of the Caucasus and Central Asia. Before that role, he also worked as a project director with the OSCE and a project assistant with the US National Democratic Institute, and has been reporting on the affairs of the Caucasus for decades now. So, we're thrilled to have him on the program today.
Because of geography, Abkhazia is quite hard to access, particularly in wintertime, and it's located on the southern slope of the Caucasus in the west of Georgia.
So it's no surprise that Abkhazia has significant Russian influence within its institutions. But when you actually start pulling on the thread, it gets far deeper than most people realize. In fact, it's a bit of a rabbit hole. So let's walk through it. Okay, so Abkhazia's first president ran Abkhazia from the early 1990s through to about 2005, the man being a Soviet-trained historian and longtime ally of Moscow. But Ardzinba had been effectively running Abkhazia for so long that he spent the last year of his presidency pretty much incapacitated and would die shortly after leaving office. Then came the country's second president, Sergei Bagapsh. Now, Sergei had been the former prime minister of Abkhazia. He'd also served time in the army and at one point was actually part of the national basketball team. Now, for the years leading up to his presidency, Bagapsh was the managing director of Abkhazia's state-owned power company and had very close ties to Moscow, but wasn't who Moscow would back in the elections. Now, from what we understand in the 2004 election, the Abkhaz Electoral Commission originally declared his opponent the winner of the election, and that Bagapsh had become a distant second, but the Supreme Court would overturn that result, claiming that Bagapsh got 50.3% of the vote. And with protesters storming buildings all over the place, Russia would step in and demand that the two ran on a unity ticket, with that ticket easily winning the runoff election. Now, with Bagapsh was not the first choice of Moscow. And in fact, when he comes to power in 2005, Moscow responds by boycotting Abkhazia's agricultural goods, particularly tangerines, which is a massive export for the country. Now, Bagapsh would eventually bend to Moscow and agree to terms, and would serve from 2005 right up to 2011, overseeing the 2008 war. However, in 2011, pressure began to really mount on Bagapsh from Russian sources, asking him to hasten a lot of economic privatization in the country ahead of the 2014 Winter Olympics in Moscow, with the relationship between Moscow and Sukhumi becoming increasingly tense. That was until 2011, when Bagapsh would travel to Moscow for surgery and mysteriously die of complications. Funny how that happens. From there we go to the country's third leader, Alexander Ankvab, who served as the country's president from 2011 to 2014, but is also right now the current prime minister of the country. Now, Ankvab was a former interior minister and a justice official in charge of a lot of the country's internal police. Now, whilst he would sign off on some of those deals with Moscow, Ankvab would regularly lock heads with Moscow, often demanding better deals for the Abkhaz people. And as a result, over those 6 years, there were 6 assassination attempts on his life. His presidency, though, wouldn't end with him dead, but instead with protesters storming his office, and Ankvab fleeing his office for the safety of the Russian military base. From there, we move to the country's fourth president, Raul Kajimba, a former Soviet Air Force officer and ex-head of Abkhazia's state security service, effectively the KGB successor in the region. Now, he was elected in 2014 after those protests that pushed the previous guy out. And once in power, Kajimba quickly moved to sign a series of pretty deeply unpopular investment agreements with Moscow, further solidifying a lot of Russian influence over Abkhaz infrastructure and security. And as things continued to worsen in the country, much like his predecessor, the pressure proved to be too much. And as a result, he was removed from office in 2020 after demonstrators stormed government buildings. His successor being Adlan Bajanya, another former head of Abkhazia's security services and a businessman with very close ties to Putin and Moscow. Now, Bajanya was the frontrunner to win the 2019 elections, but just weeks before the vote, he ended up being hospitalized with mercury and aluminium poisoning, which per capita is starting to make this look like the most dangerous job in the world. Now, that original election would go ahead, but eventually be declared invalid. And after wide-scale protests, and when a new vote was held in 2020, Bajanya would win that election. Now, having survived that poisoning and finally made it to that role, his presidency also wouldn't last very long, as he too would be forced out by public demonstrators just a few years later, which brings us to the country's current leader, Badia Gumba, who we'll talk about a bit more later. So if you've been following along, let's tally this up. Out of the 6 men that have led Abkhazia since the 1990s, one spent the last years of his presidency incapacitated, the other died under mysterious circumstances, and 3 of them have been removed by public protest. And that alone should probably tell you a bit about the country's internal politics, as well as the influence that Russia has running through it. So the question I have for you is just how deep is Russian influence here? Because whilst we see Russia helping to amp up protests and serve as the largest player in their local economy, the locals also continuously have uprisings that kick out Russia's preferred candidate. Is Abkhazia really a fully captured client state, or is it more kind of like a state like Armenia, where whilst the military and security services might lean one way, the government and the people can lean a bit the other? How would you categorize Moscow's control here?
That's good examples that you've just mentioned, particularly about Armenia, where the whole infrastructure, the gas pipeline, electricity, railway, and other critical infrastructure is actually under Russian ownership and control. As for Abkhazia, they tried to maintain sovereignty over certain strategic objects, but it's gradually falling under Russian. The large sanatoriums that occupy hundreds of square meters on the seaside, which Russia wants to serve its military and citizens. The railway, which is operated with the Russian railway company. The airport that has been recently renovated and launched. And electricity supply, of course, is under Russian control. So whether internally through the political rhetoric anyone wants to raise this issue of deviating from Russia's influence, the actual tangible infrastructures are all under Russian control.
Now, while most of Abkhazia's major infrastructure is owned and controlled by Russian state-backed firms, electricity remains one of the few points of real contention within the territory. As currently, while 40 to 60% of the country's electricity is coming in from southern Russia, the other half comes from the Inguri Dam, a massive hydroelectric facility straddling the Inguri River, which, crucially, is also the river that marks the de facto border between Abkhazia and Georgia. And here's where it gets complicated, as whilst the dam itself is physically located within the Georgian-controlled territory and is majority owned and operated by the Georgian government, under the current agreement, the two sides split power output from the dam, with Georgia taking about 60% for its western provinces and Abkhazia receiving the remaining 40%. And whilst that does sound like a fairly clean arrangement, it's anything but. Take, for example, a recent incident where Moscow proposed a new investment law that would grant foreign, which pretty much means Russian, passport holders easier pathways to acquire property and invest into Abkhazia, something that not only Tbilisi objected to, but also the Abkhaz people, feeling that even though they were poorer than the average Russian citizen, that Russians would be able to buy out real estate within the territory at an even cheaper rate. So in response, Abkhaz began to protest, and Russia responded by floating the idea of reducing the amount of electricity being supplied by its own grid into Abkhazia, effectively trying to squeeze the territory into submission. But here's the paradox. Because every time Moscow cuts power from flowing into the north of Abkhazia, all it really does is increase Abkhazia's dependence on the Inguri Dam, which again is run and owned by the Georgians. So as a result, in trying to punish Abkhazia, Moscow actually risks pushing it further towards Tbilisi's orbit, the exact opposite of what the Kremlin's trying to do. Again, this is a really complicated dam. So can you take us through how this current arrangement actually works and why it remains such a strategic headache for both Moscow and Tbilisi?
Well, there are a number of issues over which they have autonomy, but strategic topics like the port, the trade, the military bases, law enforcement, internal security, external security, also the issues of de facto governments, foreign affairs, these are under control majorly and coordinated heavily with the Kremlin. But there are lots of other utility topics related to the management of certain districts or infrastructural projects, repair of streets, water supply issues. They have autonomy over those topics. What's most important is that they are very much dependent on Russia on energy supplies. There is a big hydropower station built in Soviet times under Georgian Soviet Republic control, but it has dilapidated. Currently, the hydropower station, which is controlled by the Abkhaz Russian company, and another part is controlled by the Georgian government. So that is actually the infrastructure where the both parties to the conflict are quite intensively interacting on a daily basis.
Okay, so let's talk about that boundary for a moment. The one between Abkhazia and Georgia. Now, most of this de facto border runs right along the Nguri River, which winds its way down the Caucasus toward the Black Sea. And as a concept, that makes complete sense. Quite a lot of national boundaries are based on rivers. However, right near the coast, it breaks that rule, as the line of control between the two actually briefly darts a bit inland, before then turning back toward the Black Sea and running parallel with the river. And as a result, this leaves a very small, very exposed chunk of Georgian-controlled territory sitting awkwardly on what most would regard as the wrong side of the river, something we'll talk a little bit more about later. As what's arguably even more interesting than that is who actually controls the border, because the answer in practice isn't Abkhazia. You see, the crossing points, the fences, the surveillance, all of that is actually manned and operated by the Russian border guards, operating under the authority of the Russian FSB. And when I took the time to go through the maps, read the documentation, and then geolocate all of these positions along the border, the results were also pretty telling of the situation, as across the de facto Abkhazia-Georgia boundary, what I found is 12 Russian manned border posts, whilst on the Abkhazia-Russia border, well, there's actually just one, which should give you a bit of a hint as to who's controlling the movement in and out of this region. As the reality is that the southern boundary, the one with Georgia, is right now sealed pretty tight, meaning that even if Abkhaz citizens wanted to cross the river and engage with cousins or friends within Georgia, much like Transnistrians used to do in Moldova before the war, right now it'd be Russia's call to make. Now, you've been studying this border for a while, so can you walk us through this a bit more?
The Nguri River is believed to be the boundary line, but its delta is wide and some areas are not clearly demarcated. And plus, on that side of the river, over on the Russian-controlled side, there is the largest presence of ethnic Georgian population. The borderization of the boundary line between Abkhazia and the rest of Georgia has actually intensified after 2008 war. They built these barbed wire fences and other materials to actually divide the area and not allow the crossings that used to happen from the villages along the boundary line. And those crossings were quite a lot, actually, in different areas of Nguri River, particularly in summertime when the level of the river goes down, so people could visit their relatives, the cemeteries, or smuggle some goods. After 2008, they've gradually started to isolate the entire boundary line, and it's been quite successful for Russians. They have invested a lot in this, but border crossing is happening only through the official checkpoints, and periodically at the instruction of the de facto government or the FSB, these crossings are shut down. Trade is no more happening at any large scale. It's just petty trade. As for the Abkhaz and Russian borderline, there is a strategic agreement between Russia and Abkhazia, joint control of the border. On the contrary, there were lots of complaints of corruption and some harassment. Even the recent visit of President Putin's staff members to Abkhazia aimed to find the ways to simplify this crossing, so to allow the Russian citizens to spend summertime in Abkhazia easily. And that's why they also renovated the airport, and which is now fully functional, and the border crossing is simplified on the Russian side.
Okay, so we know that people aren't exactly flowing across that border, at least not without Russian border guards calling the shots or getting their palms greased. However, over the last few years, there has been increasing talk from both sides about the possibility of reopening old Soviet-era rail lines that once connected Abkhazia to the rest of Georgia. And on paper at least, there are clear economic incentives for doing so. From what it seems, it's actually the politics of it all that gets it a bit tricky. So how likely do you think it is that a rail connection would be revived between these two areas? And what do you think it would take for that to go ahead?
I think it's a matter of communication with the population, particularly with the displaced population from Abkhazia. The connection of infrastructure to Abkhazia is something that Abkhazia would want, particularly the gas supply chain. That's very important. Georgia is fully connected, and the gas pipelines are in remote villages here. And I think that is quite an attractive project. Plus, I believe Enguri Power Station has to be renovated, and there are also lots of other alternative projects of alternative energies, and that could be attractive. And the population in Georgia is quite supportive of that kind of interaction, but everyone will ask the question, what is the price for it? And once that question is asked, everyone will start discussing it. It's important to know what would be the price of this opening of these trade lines and integration of infrastructure. So far, it's not in the agenda on any side of the conflict, but it circulates from time to time in the conversations on Georgian media, particularly in relation to opening the railway line. But it's completely destroyed. It will take a lot of time and resources to rebuild, and there must be an investing rationale behind it. I think Russians would like to connect to its segment in Armenia and launch trains from Russia through Georgia to Armenia. But again, it looks maybe from a zoom out map quite a small area, but it's small, but terrain is very tough, and it needs lots of bridges and repairment, and it's very expensive. And I don't think that any party is ready to invest in the current context. Georgia is probably not going to invest its own budgetary resources into this. The international financial institutions will not consider it stable and pretty much risky for them. And the Russians are busy with the conflict in Ukraine. So I don't think that is a priority on any side.
Now, within Abkhazia, Russia's military footprint is centered around the 7th military base, located just outside the city of Gudauta, in the very northwest of Abkhazia, about 60 km from the Russian border. Now, under the current chain of command, this base formally answers to the Russian Southern Military District, currently headquartered in Rostov-on-Don, and also the district that right now is currently fighting the brunt of the Ukraine war, meaning that the commanders here are currently competing against the war for resources. Now, in peacetime, Moscow would typically keep around 4,500 troops stationed here in Abkhazia, as well as a handful of border forces that do border management. However, those would operate under the FSB rather than under the Southern Military District, with the military forces here in Abkhazia usually being structured around a motor rifle brigade, a collection of support units and some light infantry, as well as an anti-aircraft missile battalion deployed about halfway between Gudauta and Juncture, with this anti-air missile battalion usually equipped with S-300s or reportedly even occasionally S-400s. That being said, there have also been credible reports that in recent months, parts of this force have been drawn out of Abkhazia and either redeployed toward Ukraine or thinned out to replace manpower shortages elsewhere within the Russian system. Although there are reports saying the opposite, so take it with a grain of salt. Now, the Russian forces also have 2 airstrips available to them, one being the Bombarda airbase, which is just to the west of the base itself, and the other being the Babushara airport, although this is usually used by the Abkhaz Air Force. That one being much closer to the Georgian border, although it should be pointed out that most of the better planes are still kept back in Russia. Now, whilst this deployment has about 4,500 troops, let's compare it to the other deployment that Russia keeps inside Georgia, that being South Ossetia, where the Russian presence is a little bit lighter, this one usually being about 3,500 troops, operating out of the 4th Guards military base. However, whilst the deployment in South Ossetia is technically smaller, it should also be pointed out that, from what we understand, those troops are usually a little better equipped than what's in Abkhazia at the moment, likely because it's closer to Tbilisi and was the area that came under attack during the 2008 war. Generally though, these forces are really not equipped or designed to go on massive offensives, There's nowhere near enough logistics vehicles, and the amount of drills and training being done also seems quite low, although it is still nothing to be sneezed at. Okay, so that's the Russian forces. What about the Abkhaz forces? Because they do have their own independent military, who, whilst nominally under the command of the Abkhaz government, would reportedly fall under the command of the Southern Military District in times of war. Now, as for the Abkhaz military itself, it's actually a much smaller force than what the Russians have in the area, with the Abkhaz army consisting of a little over 2,000 ground troops, about 600 naval personnel, and about 250 personnel within the air force, with their high command based in the capital Sukhumi, a base further north in Putsunda, and a base further south in Ochimchire. Ochimchire also being the location of the Russian naval base here in the region, although we're going to talk a bit about that in the next section. Now, equipment-wise, and pretty unsurprisingly, the Abkhaz forces rely heavily on older Soviet gear, mostly T-55s, a handful of T-72s, some old outdated ZSU-23s, some books, and a smattering of Grad artillery systems. So not exactly cutting-edge stuff, but probably still enough to hold ground. Most interestingly though, when you combine the infantries of the Abkhazia and South Ossetia militaries, the two breakaway republics combined technically actually outnumber the Georgian Republic in terms of tanks, APCs, and artillery pieces, even though that combined they would only make up a small portion of the Georgian population. However, I would also caveat that those figures refer to what's in the books, and not necessarily operational. And in this part of the world, those two numbers can be very different. But for now, that's generally what Russia and Abkhazia have here in the region. A sort of tripwire force that could probably decently hold its ground for a little while until the rest of the Russian army rocks up. But a force that also probably doesn't have enough equipment currently stored there in order to go try and push in and take Tbilisi again. So what I want to ask you is, if there is this much equipment sitting just within the Abkhaz and South Ossetia militaries, why does Russia also keep such a force here? And how much has that contingent changed since the battles in 2008?
I think the contingent hasn't changed much. Maybe some equipment was sent to the battle areas of Ukraine. Also, the de facto government actually supported Russia in its special military operation in Ukraine and recruited a lot of locals to fight for Russia against Ukrainians. And there have been some reportings about the movement of heavy equipment. But honestly speaking, it's hard to verify, actually, because no independent media has access to Abkhazia, neither Georgian nor any other regional or Western media. And everyone pretty much depends on the reporting from locals or posts on social media to have a grasp of what's happening there. As for the rest of the infrastructure, whether it's a military base in Gudauta or a port in the surrounding area, the infrastructure remains the same. There were talks about the Ochimchire port that Russia may use it when it retreated from Crimea, when the Moscow ship was sunk. Georgia is also to construct a large trade port nearby in Anaklia. That area is very much contested and under control from both sides, and I don't think any serious build-up is happening. However, the port is there. It has good infrastructure. It is used for military supplies in Abkhazia and for the military bases.
Okay, so what about the other side here? What about from Georgia? Well, Georgia right now currently has an army of around 20,000 personnel at the moment, with about 17,000 of those being within the ground forces, 2,000 of those being within the special forces, and about 1,600 of those being within the National Guard. With all these guys then being joined by a paramilitary of about 5,400 personnel, with their air force being under the command of the army, and their navy being under the control of the border police. Now that air force arrangement might sound pretty weird in particular, but you also have to understand that in the opening days of the conflict, the Georgian air force was heavily degraded by Russian airstrikes, with a large number of the Georgians' key aircraft being destroyed on the ground, as well as several of the country's main repair facilities also being damaged by these airstrikes. Something that would actually turn out to be a problem for a lot of other former Soviet nations, who used to send their planes to Georgia for repairs. Now, it was during that 2008 conflict that the Georgian Navy also didn't fare much better, with several vessels being struck during the conflict, with what remained afterwards later being either scuttled or absorbed into other services. What remains of the Georgian Air Force being just 4 combat-capable aircraft and 6 combat-capable helicopters, all of which are Russian designs. But the 2008 conflict didn't just expose vulnerabilities in the Georgian Navy, it also highlighted some pretty serious gaps in Western contingency planning, as at the time, US military planners had begun trying to evaluate ways to try and reinforce or assist the Georgian military during the conflict, not with military personnel, but aid, support, or ammunition. And in doing so, they quickly ran into some pretty hard constraints. Not only are the Georgians' ports in the Black Sea quite shallow and lacking a lot of infrastructure, but there was also a severe lack of usable military-grade airfields outside of the capital, with the ones in the capital having come under attack during the early phases of the conflict, meaning that even in a hypothetical best-case scenario, rapid reinforcement would be pretty logistically nightmarish if Georgia was, let's say, a part of NATO. And even today, nearly 2 decades on from the conflict, outside of Georgia's special forces, most of the troops are still using quite old equipment. In fact, quite often the same sorts of equipment that are being used by the Abkhaz and South Ossetian forces. However, that doesn't mean the Georgian forces are poorly trained. In fact, some of these units have received pretty extensive NATO training, and whilst Russia definitely has the advantage in terms of manpower and equipment, I also don't want to heap too much praise on them either, because as much as they did walk away from 08 with a victory, they really didn't perform well in that conflict when you actually look into it. As, if we're being honest, the 08 war should have been a far more decisive win for Moscow. They had troops pre-positioned, they'd already moved logistics into the area, and they had air dominance from day one. But when you actually start reading some of the reports that came out of the campaign, the Russians really struggled with poor coordination, inadequate communications, and a lack of interoperability between the branches. In fact, there are multiple confirmed reports of Russian bombers mistaking their own ground troops and striking their own personnel. Something an army with as much experience as Russia really shouldn't be doing. With the 08 war exposing so many cracks within the Russian system, it ultimately triggered a top-down review of the Russian military doctrine and a major reshuffle within the armed forces senior leadership. Which did fix some things, but as we saw from Ukraine, didn't fix everything. So with that in mind, I want to ask you the question: what are the chances that Georgia tries to resurrect the Saakashvili-era doctrine, ramp up their defense spending to 10% of GDP, instead of where it is right now at about 1.5% of GDP, and they actually prepare for another counteroffensive to try and retake these lost territories? How likely do you think a scenario like that is today?
I think Georgia at the moment is quite clear on its strategy towards the occupied territory. It's very much focused on its own internal concerns at the moment. It probably enjoys a status quo, keeping those areas isolated a bit so it can develop the infrastructure and economic on the rest of the territories of the country. As for the military overtake, I don't think Georgia has capacity at the moment to do this. After 2008 war, Russia actually pretty much successfully convinced the Western governments to restrict Georgia to have access to weapons, and the supplies have fallen, actually, if not restricted, even from allies. Georgia at the moment is focused on economic projects and tries to be economically and socially attractive through providing healthcare programs for people living in the occupied territories, actually for free. Some benefits are even better than the Georgian citizens have, and we have pretty much successful healthcare program for the people living on the occupied territories. Also education, there is an attempt to give young people opportunities to study in Georgia and join international exchange programs through Georgian universities. I think they count on economic relationships. Abkhazia wants to diversify the sources of income, and one of the attempts was made by Bjania during his tenure, for which he was opposed to build kind of a large apartment hotels in those parts of Abkhazia on the coast populated by ethnic Georgians. However, Russia recently started a new campaign for infrastructure projects in Abkhazia and the renovation of the airport, the buildup of hospitals in Sukhumi. Also, other very impressive healthcare programs actually aims to attract Abkhaz more towards the Russian direction rather than allow Abkhaz or Ossetians to look at the Georgian direction and through Georgia to the rest of the world, including Turkey and European Union.
Okay, so with that in mind, where do you see Abkhazia going over the next 10 years?
Next 10 years will depend on larger factors in the region, the outcomes of war between Russia and Ukraine, on the developments in the Middle East as well, on the positions of United States, European Union, Turkey, on Georgia's partnership with the institutions that it aspires to join, like NATO and EU. These factors will determine a lot, I believe, but if these variables remain unchanged, the status quo will certainly continue as it is.
So at this point, neither side looks particularly ready nor willing to launch another full-scale conflict like we saw back in 2008. And Russia, for its part, also really doesn't seem eager to hand its proxies the capability to act unilaterally, especially when it's tied down elsewhere in the region. And likewise, Georgia, despite its growing Western ties, isn't exactly being handed the keys to the NATO arsenal either. And so if no one's ready for war, what exactly does that mean for peace? Is the currently frozen status quo the best option either side can hope for, or is there a genuine path forward, one where both sides can try and chart a new course and break free of this awkward housemate arrangement with Moscow? Well, to help us unpack that, we turn to our final guest.
Part 3. The Missing Piece.
Abkhazia occupies a beautiful stretch of the Black Sea coast. It's really some of the most amazing landscape you'll ever see, with these mountains and these broad rivers running down to subtropical beaches. It was a favorite destination in Russian imperial and Soviet times for holidaymakers, and still is to a much lesser degree for those Russians who go there every summer.
Thomas Duval is a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe, specializing in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus region. Prior to that, Tom worked for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and extensively throughout the region as a journalist for the BBC. He's also written quite a number of great books on the region and has become one of the go-to authorities for the politics of the Caucasus. So, we're thrilled to have him back on the program today.
Neither side really wants to let go of it. For Georgia, this is an integral part of Georgia. A lot of Georgians used to live there. This is a key stretch of Black Sea coastline. For Russia, this is also a key strategic point.
So the war has been over for more than 30 years now, and Abkhazia is coming up on about 2 decades since it was formally recognized by the Russian Federation. Now, in theory, that should have given the region time to stabilize, consolidate power, and really settle into this new reality. But I want to ask you, does everyone involved really truly understand where the red lines are, or is it still operating kind of as a ceasefire frozen in time?
We're talking about an unrecognized place, which is very corrupt, a lot of very opaque business schemes there. So who knows what's going on there already? The big picture here is that Abkhazia has basically been isolated from the rest of the world since the war. The Georgian population, pretty much all of them, fled. Since then, the Russians are there, but it never really picked itself up. When you walk through Khumi, the main town, there are still big ruined buildings 30 years after the war. This is the whole context. We're seeing a place whose status has not been resolved, and everyone continues to suffer from that.
Well, if that's the case, what is keeping the economy afloat at the moment?
Agricultural produce and tourism are the two main earners, these mandarins, these tangerines. But also the other thing that's going on is this Bitcoin mining. It also happens in another unrecognized republic, which is Transnistria. People using black market electricity or tapping into the grid to do this Bitcoin mining. That's been very lucrative in Abkhazia, although the fact that you've had all these blackouts has made it much more difficult for them.
So one of the other things I'd love to know is, why is there this stark difference between how Russia handles Abkhazia to how Russia handles South Ossetia? As on paper, they're both breakaways of Georgia, they're both supported, occupied, and effectively propped up by Russian forces, but politically, they're absolutely worlds apart, with Abkhazia having a very messy but very active political scene. In Abkhazia, you'll see presidents resigning, protests erupting, unpopular deals triggering pretty bad backlash from the general public. Don't get me wrong, it's not democratic in any Western sense, but at least there's some performance of political contestation. Meanwhile, South Ossetia pretty much functions more like a quiet military outpost most of the time. So why the discrepancy? Why does Moscow treat one like a semi-managed satellite and the other like a secured operating base?
Well, they both tried to break away from Georgia with Russian support, both in the early part of the 20th century and in the 1990s, but they are very different. South Ossetia is a very small, kind of provincial agricultural province, just located to the south of the Caucasus Mountains. Not of great strategic importance unless you really want to threaten Tbilisi, which is, I guess, what the Russians do with it. They make it a Russian military base. The population of South Ossetia currently is probably less than 40,000. In Abkhazia, it's probably 200,000. These are very small places, economically dependent on Russia. Last year, the former Abkhaz president tried to defy Russia on a couple of issues, and Russia basically started to restrict electricity supplies, and there were massive blackouts there. So these places can't stand on their own. Most of the population doesn't really want to be part of Georgia, but they can't really stand on their own against Georgia and Russia at the same time. And they tend to choose they regard as the lesser of the two evils as far as they're concerned, which is Russia.
Now, a lot of this has all come to head just over the last few years in Abkhaz politics. As we very quickly covered previously in the episode, back in 2020, President Raul Kajimba was effectively forced to resign the presidency after Moscow signaled its disapproval, to which shortly after the Abkhaz Supreme Court annulled his dubious election win, citing widespread irregularities, which cleared the way for his replacement, fresh out of hospital, Aslan Bajania. Now, at first, Bajania was seen as someone who might be a stabilizing figure, who'd done business and negotiations with Moscow before, and probably could hold his ground for Abkhazia. But over time, and particularly following the poisoning, his alignment toward Russia became increasingly one-sided, which is when the trouble really began to happen. The first major controversy erupting when Bajania attempted to hand over control of the Pitsunda state dacha, something that's quite important to the Abkhaz in the area. And this would trigger the first round of protests against him, with the second round coming not long after, when he tried to push through legislation that would make it easier for Russian citizens or anyone holding a foreign passport to buy out property in Abkhazia, which would go on to spark even larger protests than the ones from the year before. And eventually, the pressure became too much and Bajania had to step down, ushering in the current president, Badra Gumba. And so far, Moscow appears to be cautiously optimistic about Gumba, to a point where he hasn't actually had to push through any incredibly unpopular reforms yet. And for some reason, Moscow has also chosen to reward him anyway, even recently reintroducing direct flights from Moscow into Sukhumi, something that's almost certain to bring in more tourists and bring in tourist money. So the question to you is, what is Moscow's game plan here? Why reward someone who hasn't pushed through the legislation that Moscow wanted? Is Moscow becoming weak on the issue, or are they just hoping to give their man in Sukhumi a bit of street cred before they ask him to do something?
There's a new leader in Abkhazia. He was very much Moscow's candidate, so I think this was a reward to him. A key factor here is a perception that in Tbilisi they would raise some objection to this, but that Western countries have too much on their plate, that this is something which was ripe for happening and that Russians could get away with. We also see a parallel there because, after all, Turkey has direct flights to northern Cyprus, which I think officially illegal, but now been going on for decades.
Ahoy hoy, post-interview Michael here. Just cutting in with a quick note before we get back to our next question with Tom, because before we get to that, I need to take a quick detour, as we're about to ask Tom about Ochimchire, and I want to take you through the giant rabbit hole we've been through surrounding it. Now, for some context, back in January of 2024, we aired our episode Russia's 6 Fleets, effectively outlining what the purpose and size was of each of Russia's 6 fleets. And in that section, we briefly talked about Russia's supposed plans to establish a naval base here in Ochimchire. Now, at the time, this wasn't a fringe claim. Outlets like the BBC, Newsweek, and even Bellingcat had put out stories talking about this new port, all pretty much reporting the same thing, that Russia was preparing to build out a permanent naval presence here. And this claim made a lot of sense, as the port had long been used by Russia's border service for minor naval operations and light logistics, and we even had Zelensky come out and publicly warn that a strike on Ochimchire would be justified if the facility became a Russian base. And then only a few weeks later, in October 2023, President Bajania came out and politically confirmed that he had signed an agreement with Moscow to establish a naval base here on Ochimchire, at which point, not long after that, the Ukrainian Deputy Director of Defense Intelligence then also came out and claimed that Russia had begun active development on a port here in Ochimchire, pointing toward the dredging work being done to deepen the port, a claim that was also backed up by satellite photography. And that's the point we released the episode. However, time passed after that, and a few months later we decided to check back in with the port, taking a look at some updated satellite imagery and surveying the area for any structural changes. And what we found is there wasn't much being done. In fact, most of the work was actually at the very north end of the port, which are facilities for picking up and dropping off coal. However, there had been dredging done, a sign that a lot of people took to mean the port was expecting to see larger ships coming in soon. However, when we started digging back through Soviet and Russian planning documents, looking for any mention of anything to do with juncture, what we found was a lot of shit talking about the local geography and naval experts suggesting the port will need continuous dredging to stay in operation, which could explain why this dredging was going ahead. And this is where the rabbit hole begins. As whilst everyone had been claiming the dredging was to accommodate these larger vessels, as far as we can tell, no large vessels had actually arrived. And while some of the FSB facilities have been upgraded, a lot of that work was seemingly approved prior to the 2022 invasion. We also had some of our suspicions confirmed when a good friend of the show interviewed a naval officer from the Georgian Navy, who also confirmed that because of the tidal dynamics and the soil composition, that the port requires regular dredging to stay in operation. We also saw some reports that it could be used to facilitate ships as large as frigates, which, when we looked it up, would technically be true. An Admiral Grigorievich frigate only has a draft of about 4.2 meters. However, digging into it further, we also found that because of how small the port was, getting a frigate in and out of there is going to be somewhat painful. And in fact, the whole port is much better designed to probably work with much smaller civilian craft, or more likely, patrol vessels and littoral ships, effectively what the FSB guys use. And that at most, you'd probably expect to be operating maybe a corvette out of there. Most importantly, what we also saw is that since then, and as of a week ago, the satellite photography also doesn't show massive repair facilities going in, which is something that most naval bases probably require. So we had our suspicions on how effective this new base might be, which were then actually confirmed just at the beginning of June, when the new Abkhaz president came out and confirmed that he'd signed an agreement with Russia not for a naval base, but for a technical support base. Now, for those of you who don't speak Russian military nonsense, there is a difference between naval base and technical support base. As a technical support base is basically a stripped down naval facility, often just used for refueling, resupplying, maybe crew rotations, and some minor maintenance. But you can call it that because it lacks air defense systems, weapon depots, and repair infrastructure that a full naval base would require. However, those additions were also probably not things that were going to be built here anyway, as there's already an established air defense battalion just to the north of the facility. There's already a military village usable for rotating staff through just to the southeast of the facility. And there's designated facilities for ammunition storage also not that far away. So previous leaders could have probably called it a naval facility whilst it actually was a technical support facility. So it seems the definition of what this thing's going to be called can be somewhat flexible, with this president calling it a technical support base and the previous president calling it a naval base. Even though, from what it seems, we're talking about the exact same plans in the exact same facility. Hence, the rabbit hole. That said, with the port being too small, not really having the facilities for a lot of this, and from being not actually that far away from Russia, not really being that great a benefit, from what it seems, it's likely to end up as just a worse version of Tartus, another naval facility that is also regularly referred to as a technical support base by certain Russians. So for now, you're probably going to hear people calling it both a naval base and a technical support base, and both are probably somewhat a little bit maybe right. I think technically it's probably a technical support base. However, it will probably be able to do about as much work as what Tartus did, because Tartus was pretty useless as well. Anyway, look, this is probably not the most important thing in the world, but having gone down this rabbit hole, I thought there'd be a few people in here who might be interested. Anyway, back to the show. So Tom, I want to shift our focus toward the south of the country now, as we've not only seen the Russians tighten up border control a bit recently, but at the same time there's also been some talk of progress at the juncture port, although from what we've seen so far, the expansion seems pretty limited. But how would you categorize Russia's current posture here in the south of Abkhazia? Do you see what they're doing down here as genuine long-term planning or just general maintenance and posturing?
I think the bigger picture here is that Ukraine has been quite successful in damaging and hurting the Russian Black Sea Fleet, which was based in Crimea. I think Russia increasingly has retreated to the eastern part of the Black Sea, to the port of Novorossiysk, and they want to build a new port in Abkhazia in a place called Ochamchira, which will take smaller vessels. But if Crimea is not fully secure, if it's under threat by the Ukrainians, that's all the more reason to want Abkhazia. That border used to be more open. It gets more open and more closed depending on who's in power, what's going on. I think COVID closed it down. But for sure, there was a period when Abkhaz crossing into Georgia, particularly to get medical care, which was much more accessible for them in Georgia and higher quality. But yeah, unfortunately, all the political tensions of the Ukraine war have made that border a lot tighter. Basically, the Russians sent the message to the Abkhaz, if you're not on our side, you're going to have real problems. That border got more firmly shut. The Abkhaz were told to display their loyalty.
Now, obviously, we have also just seen an election happen in Georgia, with the ruling Georgian Dream Party remaining in power, and protesters taking to the street claiming Russian interference. But how close do you think Georgian Dream is to Russia at the moment?
I describe Georgian Dream as a Russia-friendly government, but they keep Russia a bit at arm's length. They've still got no diplomatic relations with Russia, a lot of informal contact with Russia, but no diplomatic relations with Russia since 2008. They're more kind of Russia-friendly, but they're not in the Russian camp. They're a long way from being, say, Belarus. I think what we're seeing there is a classic case of state capture by a group led by Mr. Ivanishvili, the billionaire who founded Georgian Dream. And for them, they felt that the West was too intrusive and try and play that game. That's easier for some than for others. Easier if you're Azerbaijan with a lot of oil wealth next door, but not so easy for Georgia, the country with a strong democratic tradition, where society is very Europeanized and socialized into the idea that we seek Europe and that we seek democracy. So that resulted in this extremely contested election.
Now, a lot of the recent political tension here stems from Georgia pulling back from its path toward European Union membership. And whilst at first glance that move looked very much like it had Russian fingerprints all over it, there is another angle worth considering here. Many in Brussels were already signalling that Georgia's progress report, just due a few months later, wasn't going to be flattering. As in Georgia, the EU is finding that the judiciary lacks sufficient independence and that key financial oversight bodies were still too politicized. And from what I understand, there was also growing awareness that they were going to fail that test inside Tbilisi, making it more understandable that the government might make this move, where instead of being told no by the European Union, the Georgian government instead decides to pull a "no, you're not breaking up with me, I'm breaking up with you," and frame the entire retreat as a matter of sovereignty rather than failure of standards. So now that the EU track appears to be hitting a brick wall, as I don't see Georgian Dream really rushing to fix the court system, what happens now? Because if relations remain stalled with the West, could they possibly look to normalize relations with Russia? For the sake of the argument, could they look at, let's say, releasing South Ossetia or Abkhazia for normalization with Russia, or even releasing them so they remove the border disputes and would have a much cleaner record to try and apply for NATO? What do you think the chances are that Tbilisi would be willing to make a calculation like that?
I don't think that's the major consideration. I think Georgian Dream's dream would be to do a deal with Russia over Abkhazia, where they got back control of Abkhazia for Georgia and the Russians let them back in. And in return, they possibly renounced some of their Western aspirations like NATO and the EU. I think that would be the kind of deal that Georgian Dream might want to have. But there's a lot of history there, and I think as far as the Russians are concerned, why make such a major concession to Georgia? So I think there's not a meeting of minds there. I think both countries want Abkhazia. Both don't care about the interests of the ordinary Abkhaz, to be honest. They are friendlier, but I don't think there's a complete meeting of minds about a common agenda in Abkhazia.
What about something simpler? Let's say reopening the train lines out of Abkhazia and connecting them to the Georgian systems.
A really interesting question, and I don't think anyone quite has the answer. I think you are seeing a lot more happening in the economic space. You're seeing direct flights between Russia and Georgia. You're seeing relaxation of the visa regime. The interesting one, as you mentioned, is would they restore the railway down through Abkhazia into Georgia, which would be something of benefit to the Russians. The Armenians would be happy because it would be a direct route for Armenia to the north into Russia. Would the Georgians accept that? Anything is possible after the resumption of flights. People would say this is a bit sinister with what's going on in Ukraine, but other people would say it is a restoration of a broken transit route around the Black Sea, and that's not a bad thing. I think those are the sort of things that we should be looking for.
What about the other player who's becoming increasingly more influential in the Caucasus, Turkey? What are Georgia and Abkhazia's relations with Turkey like?
Turkey looks quite favourably on any government in Georgia that is stable. They're quite okay with a government which has turned away from democracy and the West. Having said that, a bit of the ancient religious ideological divide between Georgians and Turks that you still see. Parts of Georgia used to be part of the Ottoman Empire, so there's a bit of a a Turkophobe strain in Georgia as well, which Georgian Dream exploits. They do that a bit cynically while having quite good relations with the Turkish government.
Now, one of the quiet sore spots between Ankara and Tbilisi, and one that occasionally bubbles up in regional discourse, is the question of Adjara and the spectre of Adjara separatism. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar, Adjara is a small autonomous republic in the southwest corner of Georgia, sitting right along the Turkish border around the port of Batumi. And while it is part of the Georgian state today, it's long had a unique demographic and cultural identity. In fact, historically, the region had a significant Muslim population, many of whom identified as ethnically Turkish or had strong cultural ties with Turkey. And while that demographic has shifted somewhat in recent years, there is still a disproportionately large Muslim and Turkish-speaking population here. Enough that the question of separatism occasionally does resurface. But how real do you think the actual threat of Adjaran separatism is? Could Georgia have a third breakaway state?
I wouldn't give those claims any credit. Adjara was one of those places in the Black Sea that passed back and forth between the Russian and the Ottoman Empire a few times in the late 19th, early 20th century. It has this indigenous Georgian-speaking Muslim population. It has this tradition of autonomy, but I don't think anyone there seriously wants to break away from Georgia and be independent or join Turkey. I don't think that's a real possibility, no.
Okay, so if we leave that in the past, where do you see Georgia's future? Where do you see the relationship between Georgia and Abkhazia going over the next 5 to 10 years?
That question depends on what happens in Ukraine and what happens in Russia. Are we going to see the strains of the Ukraine war hitting Russia, the economic, political strains of this disastrous war hitting Russia, or is it going to ride them out? And how well is Ukraine going to do? And that obviously has a lot to do with the wider geopolitics with Trump and Europe and so on. I think when you can see different futures for Abkhazia, you can see a weaker Russia in which Abkhazia gets more freedom, more autonomy, and there's more of a possibility of doing a deal with Georgia. Or you can see a continuation of the status quo in which basically Abkhazia continues to be swallowed up by Russia and lose most of its indigenous identity and autonomy. And, unfortunately, that's the course that's travelling at the moment.
So where exactly does that leave us? Well, the reality is that much like Georgia's actual geography, being that of a country wedged between two massive mountain chains, Tbilisi now finds itself caught between two very hard places. As for the government in Tbilisi, letting go of Abkhazia or South Ossetia simply isn't an option. Not politically, not strategically, and really not emotionally either. Because how do you ask your population, many of whom still bear scars from the 2008 war, to just let go of two of their provinces, to hand them to a country who invaded them just a few years ago, and walk away from territories they see as theirs? That loss would be politically devastating, not just to the national psyche, but also to the government standing at home. And the reality is that even if they were to actually consider that crazy a deal, the option on the table isn't actually particularly good either. Because not only would it not solve the judicial problems in the country, and therefore still preclude them from joining the EU, but it also wouldn't guarantee NATO membership either. Because remember, even if Georgia were to agree to redraw their borders along the lines set at the moment, trying to make this entire thing as easy as possible, right now there is still that strategic portion straddling the wrong side of the river, which means that even if they were to announce a deal at 12 o'clock, at 12:01 Russia could simply just walk across that line again, forcing all the negotiations right back to square one, with Tbilisi also being aware that they can't even solve this issue, as even if they were to give away these villages and redraw the borders, giving land to Abkhazia to try and avoid controversy, it would now put Abkhazia too close to the Georgian ports that are being attempted to be built and scare away even more of the investment the country's currently looking to rely on. For Georgia, there's just no way to abandon these territories without alienating both their population and the investment community. Okay, but that's Georgia. What about Russia? Well, for Russia, pulling out really isn't an option either. As well, sure, from a tactical standpoint, giving up their foothold in Abkhazia or South Ossetia would only mildly weaken their defensive lines. However, it would also give Russia a lot less leverage over Tbilisi, completely remove their ability to threaten some of the pipelines coming across the Caucasus, and probably most importantly, it would send a dangerous message to every other Russia-aligned country or territory, that if Russia were to simply hand over Abkhazia, you'd be almost certain that other territories like Transnistria would pretty quickly begin to lose faith in Russia and pretty quickly start thinking about negotiations with Moldova. And there's also another ugly reality here as well, that one being around the question of independence itself. As sure, it does sound nice in theory, but even if Abkhazia can't justify joining Georgia, that they become an independent state, free from both Georgia and Russia. But the reality is that if Russia were to leave, it would also probably take its money too, as it has no incentive to show that countries can break away from Russia and be financially successful. And if Russia leaves, it takes its money, its subsidies, its military protection, and when you strip all of that away, what you're left with is a tiny, fragile territory with pretty few options left on the table. You have to remember that the population of South Ossetia is only just about 2/3 that of San Marino. Even small withdrawals are going to be problems for both of these economies, as if massive chunks of the economy come from the Russian soldiers being deployed in the area, taking them away is pretty quickly going to remove some of the only people in the country who might have money to spend. Even if Russia were to hand all of these territories simply just back to Georgia for reintegration, after decades of war, purges, and rampant propaganda by both sides, that is going to be a very difficult political hurdle to jump. So for now, it seems the pieces are likely to remain exactly where they are, with the entire situation as unmovable as the mountains that contain Georgia itself. Thank you so much for checking out the show this week. I don't think I've seen an episode with so many rabbit holes in it for quite a while now, but that's kind of what we do here at the show, and hopefully you enjoy going down those rabbit holes with us. And if you'd like to keep exploring those rabbit holes with us, well, you can do so by following all of our links and info on Twitter, Reddit, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Threads, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, and TikTok on the handle @TheRedLinePod. Or if you're keen to follow me on Twitter, I'm on the handle @MikeyLeadOz. Oz is in Australia. This show can only function with the support of our amazing Patreons, who donate a small amount of money each month to help myself and the team keep the show going. And speaking of amazing Patrons, this week I'd like to thank Guy Olivier, Conrad, VPCG, Howard Green, Oxbadjulu, and Tracy. This show is only possible with the support of listeners like these guys, and we cannot thank them enough for all their support. So if you feel you can spare a couple of dollars and you'd like special access to our full video presentations, exploring topics like the likely outcome of a 2024 invasion of Georgia, or our latest livestream examining the locations of all of Russia's overseas bases, well, you can do so by jumping on our Patreon today using the links in the description, and we'd greatly appreciate it. But for now, this episode on Abkhazia is all thanks to you guys. As usual, here are 3 book recommendations. The first being Russia's 5-Day War, The Invasion of Georgia, by friend of the show, Mark Galliotti, for a better look at the war itself and some of the developments that happened in the Russian military after the conflict. The second being Abkhazia, 1992 to 2022, for a closer look at the geopolitics of Abkhazia itself. And the third being Black Garden, Armenia and Azerbaijan, by this week's guest and friend of the show, Thomas Tval, which, while mostly focused on Armenia and Azerbaijan, is still an amazing insight into the dynamics of the Caucasus and how Georgia and Abkhazia fit in. I want to thank this week's guests, Laura Lindemann, Bekar Bajalizadeh, and Thomas Tval. You were all absolutely fantastic to work with on this one. And I'd also like to give an additional thanks to the primary researchers for this piece, them being Nate Ostiller, Andrew Gundel, Ben Nutter, Ben Spencer, Jack Schenkman, and Jonah Gunn. Episodes like this always do take a lot of work to put together. I'd also like to thank the rest of my team, them being Cameron Gale, the producer, Jack Schenkman, the production manager, Daniela Juvella, Nate Ostiller, Robbie Sutton, Nick McNally, Jemima Pentreath, Ben Nutter, Genevieve Donnellan-May, Perry Grace, Gabriel Lane, Lorenz Van Kielbilk, Ben Spencer, Andrew Gundel, Scott Missler-Ferguson, and Sean Cottelem. Our research assistants and writers, Jamie Tanner, our media director, Raul Devanarayanan, our OSINT analyst, Mark Spencer, our second voiceover artist, Kashyap Maheshwari, Alexander Vulgarden, and Ethan Lee from our online team, Jonah Gunn, our production assistant, and Alexi Heimakainen, our Discord moderator, Marissa Rafter, our videographer, and Nick Much, our field correspondent. I could not ask for any better team. And lastly, the Red Line will be back in a few weeks with another international episode. But until then, thank you for listening, and good night.
The views and opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of Michael, our guests, and the Red Line podcast. They do not represent any government or organization and are solely our own. For more information, please visit theredlinepodcast.com.